You are listening to Nerd Best Friends, a podcast that covers the nerdy conversations you're already having, or wish you could. It's the nerdiest thing you'll do this week.
Welcome back to another episode of Nerd Best Friends. I am Analese, and I am here with my best friend, Rob.
Hey, it's me, Rob, your best friend, your super nerd, and your podcast co-host.
Nerd Best Friends can be found wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to Nerd Best Friends on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or if you would like to make a one-time donation, find us at Nerd Best Friends on Venmo. This is episode 39, and on today's show, we will be nerding out about our favorite books. But first, what I like about it.
You know what I decided to do this time for what I like about it, Annalise? I want to talk about Star Wars.
Oh, okay.
Because I think we've gone almost 40 episodes of this show, and I don't know that we've ever had one about Star Wars.
You're right.
Star Wars is great.
Nerd.
There's so much to like about Star Wars. There's a lot of stuff to make fun of and not like about Star Wars, but there's so much Star Wars that depending on what about Star Wars you like, there's a ton of it there for you. There's Star Wars comics, there's Star Wars novels, there's Star Wars RPGs, there's Star Wars movies, there's Star Wars animated series, there's Star Wars TV shows. There's a lot of Star Wars.
Yes, just about anything you can think.
Why is there so much Star Wars?
Are you asking me, or is that a theoretical question?
It's just a setup question to talk about why I like Star Wars.
I don't know, Rob. Tell me, why is there so much Star Wars in the everything of the universe?
I think there's so much Star Wars because Star Wars is a modern myth. I think if we look back at historical human storytelling and we talk about myths and legends and gods and monsters that have stood the test of time, I think we are living in the era that is Star Wars. I think Star Wars is our modern myths. I think there are tons of stories that are told about good versus evil with memorable characters and funny moments to the point where it has become a part of our culture in a way that it's referenced. It's seen and pictured, so much so that I bet you 250 years from now, when people are looking at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century, there's just going to be a ton of Star Wars.
I mean, that makes sense. What we know about Star Wars is George Lucas didn't create anything new in terms of storytelling, right? It's a lot of trope on trope on trope. What he did was create visual technology in the 70s that blew people's minds, and then from there expanded out into this entire universe, if you will, galaxy, if you will, of storylines in between and interwoven.
What I'm saying is, like, 2,000 years ago, they were telling stories about like Zeus and Hercules and Persephone and those kinds of things. 2,000 years from now, those are going to be Yoda and Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker.
Okay. I see what you're saying.
And the thing I like about Star Wars, when I go back and I see like, oh, what is the Star Wars that I like the most? Like, what do I really like about Star Wars? It's that everything is dirty. I think the thing about Star Wars I like the most is it's not necessarily the characters or the stories or the whatever. It's the world. It's the world building. It's how everything in the background is grungy and dirty. It looks old and it portrays a culture of whatever you're looking at and whatever planet you are. And sometimes it's clean, right? And that's very much on purpose too. When you see a Star Destroyer and everything's like gleaming clean, it's because, oh, this is just an overabundance of lackeys and soldiers that sit around shining this floor all day because they've joined the Empire. Like your imagination can run wild at every scene that you see in the background of a Star Wars movie. It's even more fun sometimes to be like, oh, I'm not really paying attention to what C-3PO is saying, but look in the background, how they took the time to like junk up that stuff so that we know that this is like a reused hangar from 100 years ago that's now a rebel base because it still has these parts of what it was and they've added the new parts of what it is. All of that stuff in the background and the world building and the settings is what I like about Star Wars.
Well, thank you for that. And you're right. Maybe it's time we add Star Wars to our list of episodes. How about some nerd mail?
Nerd mail.
So, Rob, last episode, we introduced our Patreon page, new to our podcast this year. So we got some questions about the Patreon page.
Let's talk about the Patreon. Let's go.
All right. So we have 2 levels. The first is for our supporters to help us with the basic costs of running this podcast. There's a little bit of costs involved. Our supporters helping us with those costs would be amazing.
Yeah. I mean, these are our associate producers. With their money, they're going to produce the show for all of our costs of our hosting fees, our website fees, our newsletter, all this kind of stuff that we're going to be doing. They're a part of that. That money goes directly into making the show possible.
100%. And we have a second level.
The second level is our $3 level. And the $3 level actually gets you some goodies on top of just the good feeling, the great feeling of helping support the Nerd Best Friends podcast. You also get a newsletter that goes along and follows up with every episode. So all of the different things that we're talking about, especially when we start doing our favorites or our top 5 lists, all those also rans or things that maybe we didn't get a chance to talk about because they need to get edited for time and those kinds of things. You get that extra information in the newsletter. The other thing that you get, which is very exciting at the $3 level, is you'll get an invitation to when we do bonus content, when we do extra events. So this is a win-win for everybody because 1, you get bonus content. 2, we get to have more interaction than we ever had before. And 3, it's another excuse for you and I to hang out instead of just when we record the podcast. Because I'm thinking we'll do some fun things during these bonus episodes, during this bonus content that we can do. We can have paint jams, we can have trivia contests, we can watch something. There's all kinds of stuff that we can do when we're just goofing around with our super fans, with our listeners who are part of the $3 group.
Yeah, I can't wait till we start those Nerd Best Friend hangouts. So go to patreon.com/nerdbestfriends. You'll see more specifics, and just want to say thanks in advance for inquiring about it and also for checking it out, supporting our podcast. So now let's go on to the episode. We have talked the last 2 seasons about having an episode specifically on books and books that we like to read. These aren't necessarily what we would call nerd books. This episode is not about the books themselves being nerdy or Star Wars or rather about us being nerdy readers and the types of things we like to read.
My books are all nerd books. I guess I misunderstood the assignment.
I mean, realistically, mine are too.
Realistically, my list would not have been any different either way because
exactly.
I'm a nerd.
So yes, the books are nerdy themselves, but we are also nerdy readers. Let's start with what types of genres or what types of books do you gravitate toward?
I'll start because my list is shorter. I love high fantasy stuff and science fiction stuff and comic booky stuff that is usually hero's journey stuff. It's usually action packed. It's, high fiction, right? Lots of fantastic locations and characters and things like that. We'll talk about some of those influences and stuff later, but anything kind of in that J.R.R. Tolkien high fantasy style is going to be right up my alley. We talk about science fiction. Science fiction, I usually like our science fiction with like a little bit of a twist or a little bit of a poignant look at humanity. I also spend a ton of time reading comic books. I mean, I read more comic books and graphic novels than anything else. I think there's great stories being told there. I think that there's a very a sequential or a serial nature to those where things just kind of keep going and going and build upon itself that I really enjoy. So usually when I'm reading like words on the page, if I'm reading novels, it's fantasy or some science fiction. But a lot of the times when I'm reading text, it's comic books or game books. I am someone who will purchase game books knowing that I will never play this game, but I want to read this book and get the ideas of like the setting and look at the cool art and the rule set and all that kind of stuff. Annalise, your list, I'm sure, is much longer. Tell me about your voracious appetite for the written word.
Voracious is a great word, first of all. Reading has always been, a hobby, a favorite thing that I like to do since I was very young. I just love stories. In that love of stories, I don't know that I have a particular genre, but there's definitely things I gravitate towards or make me more excited to read, such as like horror books, mystery novels, but particular mystery novels, right? I don't read, who's the really famous one? Is it Grisham? John Grisham. So there's mystery writers like John Grisham. I
thought you were talking about Tom Clancy.
Oh, Tom Clancy's one of them too, right? That's mystery and action packed. And no, that's a great pull as well. I don't gravitate towards those very much. To me, those are very tropey and I get bored of them really easy. But good mystery novels tend to be some that are related to true crime. I'm not really totally into the true crime because that can get really hard to read because it's real, but things that gravitate towards that. One of my favorite books is, I'll talk about later, has to do with the time around Charles Manson. And it's less about him as a person and more about the time and how what was going on in the late 60s, early 70s allowed for someone like that to come forward and be popular with people. So some historical reference, like what was going on socially around that time, things to learn about human nature and the past. You know, I have historical reference on there, but not necessarily history books, but books that are surrounding a genre within itself or a timeline or a decade or. You know, I used to read a lot of Nicholas Sparks, so I don't know what genre. Those aren't romance novels. They're just
hardcore
fiction.
Pornography.
Yes. If you're talking about Christian pornography. No, I'm just kidding. You know, he wrote a specific way and the books were easy to read and they're entertaining to get you in a world that's out of your own for a little while, that aren't so heavy that it sticks with you. So obviously like Stephen King, and in the last handful of years, a lot of mindfulness and self-care books about, again, just about human nature and about why we think the way we think and do the way we do, just understanding people. So those are the kind of books I gravitate towards.
Incredible. All right. So that sounds like a lot. I will say you're a big reader. So before we get started, I do want to ask, what does your library look like? Do you buy books? Are you a check out a book from the library person? Are you an ebook person? Are you primarily audiobook person? Like reading as many novels as you do, like you'll have goals. It'd be like, hey, it's 2021. And you're like, I'm going to read 21 novels this year. And I'm like, that sounds insane to me. So what is your system? It
shifts all the time and it's in the middle of a shift now. If it's Stephen King, I buy it. And in fact, we're recording this right at the end of August, and I know this episode doesn't come out till September, but we're a number of days away from his newest novel that I'm very excited about. I think I've talked about it the last couple of episodes, but it's being released within a number of days. I will go out and buy that. Now, I might go to Costco where it's a little bit cheaper, but I will go out and buy. So I think I have every Stephen King that he's ever written that I have read.
On a shelf for display, looking good? Or
a little bit of both. I haven't unpacked all of my books of boxes and I'm out of space in the nerd room. So I have some boxes. I also have some first edition Stephen Kings that are just boxed away from the sun, because I have other like paperback versions of those books that I'll read. But I've reread many of his novels a few times. I am a big fan of going to bookstores and buying books. I am one of the ones you see the meme come about saying you don't need to buy more books till you read all the books you have at home. But it's like, no, I'm going to buy more books. I'm also a big fan of public libraries.
Sure. There's memes on there about painting on your miniatures before you buy more too.
Before you buy more. Yes, exactly. How dare they? I'm a big fan of public libraries, and so I will utilize libraries. I also read a lot of graphic novels, maybe not as many as you, but I do enjoy that medium in storytelling. And especially when there's a good one out, a good series out that has piqued my interest, I will go get them and read them. Reading the graphic novels on an electronic device like an iPad has been very enjoyable. So I have a few that I own on like my iBooks library or whatever. The shift now is getting more into audiobooks because of time. I'm finding that I try to read every day and I'm finding that I can get a couple pages in before I just fall asleep. And that's slowing up my progress for this year. And I'm in danger of actually not making my goal. So I have to like start speeding up. And part of that might be starting to listen to more audiobooks. So I'm kind of all over the place, but I'm a big fan of owning them. The smell of books, going to bookstores is one of my favorite things to do because I can spend hours in them. It's a must stop for me when I go to Portland. Is I'm spending half a day, if not more, in Powell's Books.
Yeah, finding a good bookstore they're few and far between these days. But yes, if there is one, there's just so much stuff to look at. And it's just different than shopping online. Like you could shop online and it's all there, but it's not the same. It's just such a cool experience going to a bookshop. All right. I'm going to start with my first book, my first favorite. And
before you get there, let me ask. So we each picked 5. Out of the 5 that you picked,
Mm-hmm.
Are they in a ranked order? Should we go 5 to 1?
Not necessarily. The way
Okay.
I chose mine were something that you mentioned earlier. It was like, what are those books or series that I've reread again and again? Because there's a lot of books that like, yeah, I'll read and like, that was a great book and check that box. But there's some that I just keep coming back to, right? Like a favorite movie or a favorite whatever. Like these are favorite books that I've reread. So that was my criteria, was what are the series that I've read over and over again? Now, there may be some on there that I've read over and over again. I'll have to, oh, yep, you know what? There are. There's definitely story. You're going to have to get that newsletter, guys.
Yep. Okay. So in no particular order, your first favorite.
Are yours in order?
You know, my number 1 is number 1. The others I would have to reorder. That's okay. We're not going to reorder them now while we're on the show. But I will say my number 1 is my number 1. If you ask me for my all-time favorite book, it would be my number 1.
Okay. Let's pretend that I did that too. Don't tell
okay.
anybody. All right. And we'll get to our number 1 at the end of the list. The first one I chose is the Dragonlance novels by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss. I've even talked recently on the podcast that I did another read through of those, this time on audiobook, trying to get ready for the new novels that that writing team has come out with last year. And it was once again very, very enjoyable. These are books where, I have the role-playing game. I have the graphic novel versions. I have at one point I had all of the novels individually. At one point I had the omnibus with like the author annotations in the sidebar, those kinds of things. I've done the audiobooks. The Dragonlance novels are just plain old D&D, like high fantasy novels. What's cool about them and why I keep going back to them is they're just different enough from the Forgotten Realms where like the D&D adventures take place, right? Most of the stuff that we play when we play D&D is all in the Forgotten Realms. There's your Waterdeep and your Baldur's Gate and your Phandalin and your Red Lark. And like, it's all that like vanilla baseline foundational world. The Dragonlance world is like that, but it's just a little different. The dwarves and elves are just a little bit different. They don't have halflings. They have kinder, which are like a totally different kind of species that are really fun. And then there's dragons everywhere, right? It's like, it's called Dungeons and Dragons, but like dragons are like rare and special. What if we took that and we cranked it to 11 and it was just lousy with dragons all the way down. So I love that, of course. You know, I love some of the characters, right? If I'm going to go back and I'm going to read these books again and again, it's because I want those character moments. For me, specifically, it's the relationship of the two brothers, Raistlin and Caramon Majir, and their adventure that they go through and the way that they grow and change both apart and back together. I think that they are very influential in the characters that I make when I play Dungeons and Dragons. I think it's a really cool story that took it's a long arc almost to the point of sort of like a Harry Potter people talk about with Harry Potter. Like if you were around the age of Harry Potter when those books came out, you kind of grew with the character because there was so much content and it was coming out in those years. This is kind of the same thing. Over the 10, 12 years of these two authors writing about these characters, they grew and changed and very much like a real person would, or that relationships you might have in your life. So that's something. And then the other thing is they're old. I mean, the first ones, especially Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragons of Winter, whatever, they were written in the 80s when D&D was coming out and they were trying to sell Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like they're promotional, at their worst, right? They're just promotional material. Of course, these authors went above and beyond that, but like there's points in there where you can hear the dice rolling as they're talking about like the spells and the cooldowns and stuff. And it's like, it's so D&D. Like it feels like going back and playing that game with my old imagination. Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah. That's the Dragonlance novels. Those are my first ones. They are old, they're 30, 40 years old at this point. So a modern audience going back to read them, like think about that. If you do go to read them, it's like, wow, this seems kind of basic or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but they didn't do it like that then.
Right. They did it to build its own sequence, right? They did it to build that world for you. Yeah.
So what do you got for your first entry in your books?
So the first one I chose, like I mentioned before, is my number one favorite book of all time. It is called Different Seasons by Stephen King. Different Seasons, it's a collection of 4 novellas. I didn't know what a novella was novella. I say novella. I don't know which way is right. I didn't know what it was until I read Stephen King. And essentially it is too long to be a short story, but too short to be a novel, right?
Okay.
So 4 novellas, and Stephen King, he publishes collections of short stories, which are also very great. And then there's a few collections of novellas. Some of them he wrote under a pseudonym, which is really awesome. But this one in particular, Different Seasons, this is the book when people who haven't read Stephen King, when they ask me what's a good way to start, if I'm like really scared to read It and The Stand and Carrie and all his really famous, The Shining, all his really famous deep horror novels, if they're really reluctant to read something that scary, I point them to Different Seasons. Different Seasons is a novella for each of the seasons, and they each have a different theme. 3 of the 4 novellas in this collection ended up being movies. One of them is called The Body. That became the movie Stand By Me. One of them is called Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption. Obviously became Shawshank Redemption. One of them is called Apt Pupil, which became a movie called Apt Pupil, which wasn't as popular as Stand By Me or Shawshank Redemption, but a very good adaptation. That one is about a young man who's obsessed with the Holocaust and reads old novels and old magazines, and randomly in his neighborhood recognizes this guy and figures out he's a fugitive from the Holocaust and is a German soldier who's hiding in America, kind of blackmails him to tell him stories about the Holocaust and his involvement in it. And then it just goes down a Stephen King-esque rabbit hole of awfulness. Pretty good movie. Didn't do as well as the other 2. The 4th one's called The Breathing Method. It is about a doctor at the turn of time in helping a young woman understand a breathing method to help with her pregnancy. But there's all kinds of complications because we're talking long ago, before we knew what Lamaze was.
So it's not about Henry Lamaze.
No, it is not. It's about this poor woman who's being ostracized because at the time she's pregnant with a married man's baby and all the stuff that comes with that in the early 1900s. But the 4 of them are great. That is a series that I have read at least a dozen times over the years. It was one of the first Stephen King books I picked up. The very first Stephen King book I picked up was called 4 Past Midnight, which is another 4 set of novellas. I like this one better. I think this was the 2nd or 3rd book I picked up, and I was like 15 at the time. So,
and this is the one you recommend. This is your go-to for
when
folks.
Someone doesn't want the horror, but they want to start reading Stephen King, this is it.
So it's a novel, and then it's a novella, which I guess you're right. It should be a novella, but I say novella.
I say novella, yeah.
Which doesn't bother me, but I swear to God, when people say biopic instead of biopic, that really grates my cheese. Is that something you've run into?
Yeah, I think I catch myself saying biopic too, just because phonetically.
It's a biography picture. It's a biopic. Yeah.
Well, that's what gets me totally unrelated about people who say Latin X, because we don't say Latin O. No. We say Latino or Latino, right? So why do we say Latinx or Latinx? It should be Latinx.
Right.
Or Latinx.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is
same
tissue
idea.
paper made for Mexicans.
Sure. Nerd. My number 1 is number 1.
Awesome. Next on my list is another book series, ironically, from the 80s. This is The Incarnations of Immortality by Pierce Anthony. This is a book series where each of the novels takes the perspective of a personification of something ethereal. So, for instance, the first book is called On a Pale Horse, and it is about death and what it means to be death. I believe somebody comes in and they kill death, or they take over for death. And this person now has to learn how to be death. And all the magic of there's so many people who die in any given moment on the earth, kind of creative ways of explaining that. How you judge, or is it the death's place to judge who lives and who dies based on what they're doing and how they died and all this kind of stuff. And what I like about it is it asks those questions and it makes you kind of think about those things in a deeper way. The second one is about time in the same way. It's a personification of time and how time flows, how we see it go from, left to right linearly, but it doesn't, because in time you can jump around and all of this kind of stuff. There's another one about fate and what is it like to be fate and see the web and string those things. It's books that asks questions, very science fiction in the sense that it's looking at humanity and taking themes and taking big thoughts, asking questions about it. And by asking questions, I mean, it's explaining how this might work in these fantastical, crazy ways. It's also interesting that it takes place in modern times, it's the 80s, so it's pre-cell phone, but a lot of the stories of these people who are these incarnations of immortality is happening in cities and driving cars and trains and those kinds of things that make it different from when we think about mythological things like the Grim Reaper. You might think like, oh, it's some kind of like high fantasy or like horror genre, like, you know, something otherworldly, but it's not. It's just like New York, these folks taking place. I remember that being an early like science fiction, an early kind of like, oh, this mixed science fiction things, but also like mythological, like fantasy themes. I really enjoyed it.
And it's a series.
It is a series, yes. So like the first one's about death, the second one's about time, the next one's about fate, the next one, I don't know, there's one about Mother Nature, like stuff like that. All these, you know, these ideals that we kind of personify. There's a character for that, and it dives deep into those questions.
Do you read them in order, or could you just pick one? Are they independent?
I think you could read them out of order. I don't remember, unless like later on they started referencing things, but I know for sure like the first 3 or 4 like core series that he did, you could go in any order. They're standalone, but eventually they're all within that same theme.
My second book I read really late in life, and it actually kind of makes me mad. I didn't know it existed. I mean, that's kind of a theme with me, right? We've talked about this before. How do I not get spoilers on things? How did I not know that the newest Spider-Man was going to be a 2-parter? Like, I know
there's a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie out right now, and it's fantastic, right?
I did know that because of the previews of when I went to watch the Spider-Verse movie, and I hear it's really good.
Ahsoka Tano TV show that is season 5 of Rebels, right?
Yes. I have not watched it, but I do know it exists. I have seen some previews for it, but I do miss a lot of that. And same can be said with books. There's a lot of really great books out there. This one in particular, what makes me mad about it is it existed when we were in high school. And my experience as a brown person, as a Chicana, as a Mexican American in high schools in the United States would have been deeply impacted by reading about someone like me who was experiencing things in the classroom like Sherman Alexie did growing up in the United States as someone who lives on a reservation. Now, I didn't live on a reservation. I'm not that deep, but the cultural things that come from my native heritage as well as my Mexican heritage are so alike. The experiences that he talks about in his book, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. So it is on my favorites, and it's a recent, within the last 5 years, added to my favorites because it impacted me as a full-grown adult. Would have been absolutely phenomenally impactful 30 years ago when it was a new novel and we were in high school. That my experiences weren't unique, that the way people regarded me in U.S. classrooms wasn't new. And other people were experiencing it as well. So
would you have been ready for it at that time, or is it in hindsight that it's better? When it was like during your youth, could you have looked at it and analyzed it that way, or were you just kind of going through day to day? That's
a good question, because I've thought about that as well. Is it more impactful now that I'm an adult because he goes through stages of his life as well? So I think of that in the same way I think of a novella Stephen King wrote called Rage that I read when we were in high school. This book is about something totally different, but it read to me in a specific way when I was in high school. It reads to me in a different way now. It's like watching teen movies now and agreeing with the adult characters versus teen movies when we were kids agreeing with the kids. There are parts of it, his descriptions of what happened to him in the classroom were so like a lot of experiences that I had growing up in Santa Barbara and being in the classroom. And given the brain that I have, I don't think I'm very smart, but I understood school very easily. So I found myself as one of the only brown people in advanced classes. And the way I was regarded in those classes, like I didn't belong, was his experience in his classes as well. That would have been absolutely impactful to me. His other stuff about when he was older and how he had to live through his life, that part would have been just meh. But as I gotten older, I would have shifted to understanding that more. So there are pieces of this that absolutely would have been really comforting and impactful for me as a 15, 16-year-old, for sure.
And you would recommend it to students now?
It is actually part of, it's what's really great about the state of California is the state has started to require ethnic studies to graduate. I believe the class of 2030 must take ethnic studies. So schools right now are already embedding it into their classrooms. The school that I just left has a full-time slate of ethnic studies. And the school I'm at now, I think we have 2 or 3 classes of like periods of it available. Mm-hmm. This is one of the books on the reading list, as are books like The Hate You Give. I'm just jealous of what they're being able to read at the high school level right now. That would have been more relatable to someone like me than To Kill a Mockingbird and Lord of the Flies,
sure.
Which were also impactful to me. Shakespeare, also impactful to me. The idea of adding ethnic studies is that you're reading it all instead of just one area of books. So this is actually on reading lists for those ethnic studies courses. And I'm excited for kids that get to read it now.
My next book or book series is, well, let's start with a story. When I was in college, I had a friend who revealed to me the world that is the tabletop war game Warhammer 40K in particular. And this is just a huge, sprawling, like tons of miniatures that you got to build and paint on the board and move around your dudes and roll dice and kind of complicated and all this stuff. But what it also has is a metric ton of lore that goes around with it. The story about Warhammer 40,000 is, of course, it takes place in like the year 40,000, right? So 38,000 years into our future, mankind has spread across multiple galaxies, inhabited planets, all this kind of thing. And the leadership at some point turned into it became less about exploration and much more about colonization and conquering worlds and bringing the entire galaxy into the imperium of mankind, whether, suffer not the alien to live, this galaxy belongs to us kind of thing, which is another cool thing about it. There's no good guys in Warhammer 40K. Like you think, oh, like the humans, that's our perspective. No, they're terrible colonizers who go around murdering everybody. Most of the aliens are just trying to like fight for their survival and all this kind of stuff. There's just this huge history of all of this stuff, and just the way it sets up this grim universe of humanity is spread so far and wide, and they got here on these gigantic starships, but so much time has passed that the original people who built those and discovered the technologies and stuff are long gone. So technology is just kind of this black box to the point where, they'll pray to the machine spirit to hope that the spaceship goes and stuff like that, because they don't really know the technology behind it and all this kind of stuff. But they're retrofitting things and building new war machines and all this kind of stuff. Like it's very interesting. And there's just books and books and books and books. And one of the big things about Warhammer 40K is that there are like gods and monsters, right? So in the cosmos, in the depths of the warp, which is kind of their light speed technology, like their wormholes so they can go far, are these like mysterious beings that are like these gods of chaos. And they corrupt people and turn them. So there was a point where the Imperium of Man, the Space Marines, split, where some were corrupted by these supernatural powers in the warp and fought against the order and the Imperium of this colonialism, this kind of stuff. And this was led by the Emperor's son, Horus. This is called the Horus Heresy. The Horus Heresy has its own version of the game, but it also has just dozens and dozens of novels written about this time of when the Imperium Man split because of this influence of chaotic powers. And I have read these books so many times. They're just otherworldly, they're sprawling, they're violent, they're gory. They're war books basically, but with this sci-fi tint. And then it's got this like supernatural influence that goes through. Again, in college, when I discovered Warhammer, I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, oh, there's all these books. Let's look at this. Like, where should I start? And everybody's like, oh, the Horus Heresy books are fantastic. Start there. So okay, cool. False gods. Let's go. And I start reading through and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. I've never read books like this. It's like the boring, war books that, your grandpa would have, but this one's got spaceships and lasers and aliens and stuff in it. It's so rad. There's just a ton of them. And I had shelves and shelves full of these. They're like easy read, just tear through them. So I would do that. I read these through college and my young adult life. And then of course there's the audiobooks available. And what's better when you're painting dozens and dozens and dozens of Space Marines to keep you motivated, but listening to the books about the Space Marines and like all this kind of stuff. So those are ones that, especially with the audiobooks, that like I've just gone back to a few times because I know it's going to be just easy read or an easy listen while I'm getting excited about painting way too many miniatures. I don't pay for that game anymore. It's bananas.
That's all blowing my mind. I had no idea Warhammer had that deep of a meaning behind it.
It is, I mean, I would guess hundreds of novels
Jeez.
about these different things. Yeah. And
Would
the
you-
books
would
are
you-
like the books are an inch and a half thick, and like
Oh,
a
man.
quarter inch of that is rules. All the rest is all the like lore and explanations of all the different worlds and
Wow.
different species and stuff.
No, I had no idea. None. The next book on my list is also the first of a series. The series itself, some of the books get a little wonky, but the next on my list is Darkly Dreaming Dexter by Jeff Lindsay. So this is, for me, the perfect mix of the horror, crime and mystery, of the anti-hero, and a slew of characters that you really become interested to learn more about as they grow. It is the book that the Showtime series Dexter is based off of, that's starring Michael C. Hall. I mean, talk about your antihero. If you know nothing about the series, books or show, it follows a character named Dexter who was a victim or witness to a very violent crime at a very young age that wired his brain to basically be a psychopath. And that trauma he carries with him. He is adopted by a police officer that finds him at this really gruesome scene. Police officer recognizes these homicidal serial killer-esque behaviors of this young man as he's growing up. And in his own deranged anger, as his career as a police officer ends, his anger at the bad guys getting away with it because of some technicality of the law or because someone didn't collect evidence in the right way, but we know this person's a bad person. He trains this young man, Dexter, to avenge and kill people who are bad people. So you sit right in the middle of, we know he's a serial killer, and this is how he was trained to get away with it by his adoptive police officer father. And also, hero and anti-hero, he's going after people that he does research. He becomes, as an adult, he becomes a blood analyst for the police. He works for the police. And so he uses his access to cold cases and he stalks out people as part of his serial killer needs to ensure that they are bad people. And once he has the proof, he goes and does his...
This is the book or this is the show?
It's both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the show is a pretty true then. And then is the book a series? Like
the book is a series. So
okay, gotcha.
Yeah, the show went 8 years and the series I think is also 8 books. However, they delineate at the end. What happens at the end of the first book and the first season are a little bit different. So the book goes in a different direction than the series does. And the series is really good till it gets to the latter seasons. It gets a little wonky. They just did a final season on Showtime about 10 years, 12 years after they ended it really, really badly. And they made up for the really bad ending on the show. But those prongs are totally different once you get past the first book. So the season 1 of the series and the first book are identical till you get to the very end.
I did not know that.
Yeah, this first book is really, really good. It follows the whole, you have this long stemming overarching big bad, just kind of like Buffy does, right? There's a big bad over the course of the year, of the course of the book and the course of the first season. The connections that are made at the end of that are the same, but what happens to the people in the story are a little bit different. So this book itself is really good. Jeff Lindsay does just a magnificent job of the character Dexter and the battling of the thoughts of trying to fit in society and be a good person and knowing he has this thing. He calls it the dark passenger that he needs to feed. And he knows it's a sickness and he knows it's because of this thing that happened to it's just so really, it's so good. Michael C. Hall did a beautiful job portraying Dexter. I think I've talked about this on a show before, but he does this beautiful job of being this like family man. He's dating a woman with 2 kids and he's playing with the kids. And then a minute and a half later, he is this psychopath murderer. And just the faces he's able to turn on and off really mirror what you're reading in the book. So it's a good book. It's an okay book series. It is a good show and it's an okay show. But the first season, first book, just beautiful.
Okay, I'm going to go to my next one, which is some people are going to groan because it's kind of tired. But I'm going to talk about the Legend of Drizzt books by R.A. Salvatore. Now,
Grown.
oh man,
I don't tell me what this is. I don't even know.
Okay, so R.A. Salvatore was, again, one of these Dungeons and Dragons writers who just has novel after novel after novel of this character that people have fallen in love with. And every time these books come out, they're a New York Times bestseller, right? And he's probably written 20 of them. And so because they're popular and because they've been around for a while, they catch a lot of hate, right? You know, oh, another Drizzt books. Oh, you're such a basic fan, right? Let me guess. You read the Drizzt novel, like that kind of thing. And it's like, yeah, I do. I love them. And I was around from the beginning of them and all that kind of stuff. The other thing is he's a dark elf and he does two swords and he's kind of an edgelord. Like, it was definitely written for emo Dungeons and Dragons kids,
Okay.
So when you show up to your game, there's always that kid whose your first D&D character is, well, I'm a dark elf ranger with two swords and a panther, and this is what I do.
And some edgy background.
It's some edgy backstory, right? And all this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, sure. So people kind of give that a lot of hate. They groan, but I've been reading these books for 30 years. And as they come out, I keep reading them and I'll go back and read some of the first ones. This is, again, one of those ones where it's like, I've got the novels, I've got the audiobooks, I've got the graphic novel versions, I've got the role-playing games, I've got the miniatures that I've painted, I've got the board game, I've got, like, it's a popular series, and I think it's popular for a reason. And I think that reason is it transcended the first series that was definitely written to hook 16-year-olds into this genre. Instead, this character took on an entire life that, we've grown up with. And the author especially has. A lot of times the character will deal with things like a death of a friend or things like that. And they'll ask R.A. Salvatore, what is this about? Like, we can tell, like, this is somebody. And he constantly is like, no, Drizzt isn't me. Like, this is just this story that I care. And it's like, there are things that are just too real, to kind of believe it. But I think that's one of those things of, like, having an author that, like, you can grow up with that author as well. When you read the first three books, the writing style is very different from if you read 30, 31, and 32, right? And you've seen that progression and you've seen that change, and that goes along with the characters as they've gotten older and as they've had more experience and are a little wiser about the world. They make different decisions as well. All the characters are awesome. Like, it's a core adventuring party of a ranger, a barbarian, a thief, and a dwarf fighter. And it's awesome. It's just fun. It's cool. It's Dungeons and Dragons as Dungeons and Dragons can be. Bob Salvatore is going to keep writing books, and I'm going to keep buying those books and reading them and liking them despite the hate. They're awesome. And again, he took that, like, oh, here's our Dungeons and Dragons world, but I want to tell a different story. My story is what happens in the Underdark with the dark elves and the different monsters that are down there and all that kind of stuff, and built a world that wasn't one that already existed at the time in that genre. This is, it's a matriarchal society. There's a ton of political intrigue. The different houses have different standings, and there's different kinds of murder and assassination as a way of life and all this kind of stuff that sounds dark and edgy. But at the time, it was a new part of that genre that were stories that hadn't been told before.
So are you saying he's writing more now? Like, they still come out as new?
They still come out.
Wow.
August 15th, 2023, Lolth's Warrior, Way of the Drow, Part 3 in his next series. Yeah.
This is such an unusual name, even in the land of unusual names with Dungeons and Dragons. I always looked at that name as like a joke name. You know what it reminds me of? Master Shake and the Drizzle.
There you go.
With his black business cards with black font.
There are even, like, this series has gone on so long and it's like gotten popular. There's a point in a book where somebody mispronounces the name and they're like, oh, it's the legendary dark elf Drizzt. And they write it phonetically like that because, like, Bob Salvatore would go to all these conventions and stuff. He wrote it to be Drizzt, kind of like other languagey, and people would come up like, I love the Drizzt books. And so he was like, oh, I gotta write that in because it happens so much.
My next book is titled Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson, and it's by Jeff Gwynne. And here's the one I reference.
Horrifying.
It is. I mean, horrifying is Helter Skelter.
Mm-hmm.
That book was written by one of the lawyers who prosecuted the Manson family and Charles Manson, and it is detailed and really hard to read. Yes. This book, on the other hand, it talks about Charles Manson in terms of the power he was able to hold over other people and how that related to what was going on in society and the country and the world in the late 60s and early 70s. So it talks about how you plop Charles Manson down any other time in the history of the United States, and he doesn't succeed in the way he does, right? And it talks about how he was able to recruit people into his quote unquote family and what was going on in society. The late 60s is when or the 60s itself, right? The era of Woodstock is when we really started to see a breakdown in what were known as traditional family values, the Leave It to Beaver 50s, the breakdown, like, divorced parents and broken homes and kids who were neglected that started all of this stuff in the 60s. And just it talks about just being a perfect storm for someone like Charles Manson to get people to believe in the things he believes in and brainwash them and get them to do these evil deeds for him, and just how he was able to do it, which is why there's still some folks in jail. Every time their parole comes up, it comes back to one of the defenses on their end is that it comes back to how brainwashed they were in believing that he was a messiah and he was speaking the absolute truth. And so it's about what was going on in society more than it's about Charles Manson. And that's what's, to me, is really striking about it. Historically, what was happening in San Francisco in the late 60s, right? You go to Haight-Ashbury and it was the drug culture and it was messing with people's minds and it was the anti-establishment, all of those things, and how that culture built and also the Church of Satan was built at this time, right? Mm-hmm. How some people took that really, really seriously versus just being, I think
what it is today is basically like a silly thing that like atheists use, right? It's like a label you can put on to be like, hey, let's be anti-establishment kind of thing. But I don't know like the history of where it came out. Like you're talking about the 60s.
That's the initial start of it. It's that. But then you had people who were taking hallucinogenic drugs and living on the streets. And again, this breakdown of what our society thought was family values built up and ratcheted up to where people just met in these small groups and created these types of things. And then you just plop in a psychopath like Charles Manson and his ability to influence others because he can provide for them those hallucinogenic drugs and then feed them a bunch of nonsense to get them to believe that he is telling the truth of the world and follow me. And it's what we see at occultists now, only from a psychopath instead of just someone who wants to control people and control money, right? It's really interesting in that way and understanding how all of that works. So
another book I will never read, but thanks for sharing all of these.
Who knows? Maybe you get bored at some point.
No, I do look forward to the listener interaction, like the nerd mail coming out of this one to talk about
100%.
like which books they've also read, like which ones they identify with, because our lists are very different, of course. And, maybe even some recommendations. Oh, if you like this, Rob, have you read blah, blah, blah? Like, I would love to hear that as well.
I am also going to say, I think you cheated because all of your picks are multiple books. And I purposely tried to stay away from that. I picked standalone books instead of series.
I mean, I could choose one from each of these if you want me to.
Nope, this is great. I love it.
That's kind of how they go, right?
Yeah, no, I love it. It's all good. You were just about to talk about your
for my final one, I'm going to talk about another book series.
Mm-hmm.
This is, of course, the grandfather of them all, right? This is where all of us nerds start. This is where high fantasy for me began. And this is, of course, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I read this book probably for the first time when I was 11 or 12. And I remember it being difficult. Like it was a difficult read because the language is a little more old timey. And I remember going back and giving it another chance, like maybe my senior year of high school, and reading it again and enjoying it even more. And then I remember another time when I was like deep in college, or maybe after college, when I kind of like graduated and I was working and, moved out on my own. And I was like, wow, I haven't read a book in so long, like for fun book in so long. And I had, like a really nice set that my uncle had given me that had never been cracked open because it had been years ahead of there. And so I grabbed that down and I read it again. And then the movies came out. I'll be honest, as much as I love the Lord of the Rings books, I will probably never read them again, because the movies are so good and such a faithful adaptation that I can just watch those, especially those extended editions. They have everything in them. They're just brilliant. And so never has there been a world more meticulously detailed than Middle Earth and J.R.R. Tolkien. This dude has books and books of just like the histories and timelines of things that happened before the story that we're familiar with. And of course, it's just this classic good versus evil. It's a reluctant hero. It's the little guy who should be helpless is the most important person in the universe, right? It's all of those tropes, but it's just done in that original, loving, wonderful way. If you have never read the books and you're like me, a big fan of those kinds of things, of high fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons, and you've watched the movies and loved them, like, do read those books. It's absolutely, something to click off on your nerd bingo card or put on your bucket list or whatever, is to actually go through and read the Lord of the Rings novels. My gosh, next best thing is absolutely those movies. They're just perfect.
And it took a really long time for those books to become movies, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So J.R.R. Tolkien, there's a lot of themes in The Lord of the Rings, especially like The Hobbit, which was the first book standalone from the series. The original title of that is There and Back Again. And what that book really does mirror is Tolkien's time in World War I and going off on this journey, going off on this adventure to a faraway place and having these adventures and seeing horrible things and having to fight for survival, and then coming back and not exactly knowing. That's where the Lord of the Rings trilogy starts up, is with this character who's aged, who has come back from their great adventure and doesn't really feel like they fit in. They have this experience that no one around them in their quiet little village does, and it's eating at them, and they're different because of this experience, and that leads them on to going out and seeking other things. So that's the era where that took place, was that post World War I storytelling. And then, when did Lord of the Rings come out? 2000?
It's something like that. Yeah.
We just had like the 20th anniversary a couple years ago or something like that. So it would have been right around 2000.
I forget these books are that old, right? Because the movies were more modern. I forget that they're that old. But it also pinged. I mean, we started this episode talking about Star Wars and all the universe expansion from there. This is kind of the same thing, right? Good versus evil with all the universe expansion available. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it does tell like a very personal story of the characters that it goes through, much like the family in Star Wars, right? Everybody's a Skywalker at some point.
Right.
That does happen as well in like his books, like everybody's a Hobbit, all the important players are going to be a Hobbit. Like it's not going to be it's never going to be like the gallant knight in shining armor riding a dragon that really saves the world. It's going to be the meekest among us. Right. That's the theme there.
The last book on my list is another Stephen King. Surprise, surprise. But I really went for favorites, and this is one. It is a very good novel called 11/22/63. Mm-hmm. Now, just off the bat, does that date mean anything to you?
Well, actually, I do know about this one, and this is the time travel book about the Kennedy assassination, right?
Correct. So that is the title of the novel is the date that Kennedy was assassinated. And this book is about a man who finds a time travel tunnel with the help of someone. And there's a bunch of time travel rules that go with it. Read the novel if you'd like to know more. But essentially, he has the potential to stop the assassination of JFK. Not going to tell you what happens, because it's that good of a book. There is a series that was made for, I think, Hulu, starring James Franco. Okay. I think, James Franco. That's a number of years old now, and it is pretty close to the novel.
Would you recommend it, or novel all the way?
I think the novel is worth reading. It's one of those where you should really read the novel before you watch the series. But if you end up just watching the series, it's pretty close. I think the ending's a little bit different. And as Stephen King tends to actually write very well, there is a romantic plot line in it that the show focuses more on, in my opinion, than is in the book. I mean, it's there. It's one of the main plot lines, but that romance, this romantic storyline between two characters, is a piece of the puzzle versus the focus of the puzzle. But it's a very good book. It's a good read, and you do not have to like horror. This is very much not horror-like. Very creative, very interesting. If you are a fan of reading science fiction about time travel, this is something that adds on to the lore of what time travel could be and how it affects the past and the present. And right, there's some different rules here than before, such as when he goes through this time travel thing, when he goes through this tunnel, he lands at the same time, the same place every single time.
Right.
And he ages in real time when he's there. So if he is with us, if this guy was with us today and left and he'd come right back to us, it would be a matter of seconds. But to him, he's been gone for 5 years. He's aged 5 years. But also means if something happens, if he fails at what he's trying to do and he goes back through the tunnel, he's got to go back to that same date and same time and live out those years to get to his goal. Because he doesn't come in, the day before Kennedy's assassination. It's years before. There are things like that he has to weigh against his current life and what he's building. And very funny little things like the time tunnel is in a burger shack. That was his favorite place to eat in town, and always wondered how the Burger Shack owner could sell this really fresh foods for early prices. He learns that he's going through this time tunnel and going back and buying the meat at 1960s prices and coming back and so there's some cool things in terms of time travel that Stephen King plays with, which is it's really good. So
this one is intriguing. Yeah, this one is intriguing to me because of that time travel story. It gives me a bit of Quantum Leap vibes where, you're going back in time. It also has kind of that, like you were saying, you always come back to the same point, kind of that Groundhog's Day is another one of my favorite time loop movies. Just asking those questions of what it takes to put right what once went wrong, or where is our place in that, and should we really, and those kinds of things I'm sure in there, which definitely sounds intriguing to me. That's probably the one on your list for sure that I would actually take your recommendation on.
There's actually some great learning in it that we who grew up in America and learn U.S. history. There are some almost NPCs, if you will, auxiliary characters that were impacted before Kennedy's assassination that we don't hear about. And so these are really historical places that Stephen King has this character go to, almost like if you stop this, we don't even have to worry about the assassination. So he comes at it at a bunch of different angles, kind of like Terminator, right? If I go back in time and kill this awful president as a baby, we don't have to deal with him in the future, right? So it comes at that angle a few different ways. It's really interesting. It's another one that places that historical place and time and gives you more information that we may not have had before.
Oh my
gosh.
Our
list.
I know. Good for us. There's so many other books that you've read. I mean, there's probably 3 other books that I've read, but there's a million other books that you've read. So like we talked about earlier, this is the time to get on that Patreon, get that newsletter so you can see our other picks. It's also going to be a great place for there's back and forth on there, right? When we put out a Patreon post, you can comment on it and we'll see those and we can answer questions and stuff. So that'll be real fun as well. That's where the cool kids are.
Okay, Rob, let's get right into it. What is the nerdiest thing you did this week?
Well, I talked about it last episode, and by God, we did it. We wanted to change some things up around in the nerd room, and we couldn't change those things up around because we moved some furniture. We decided we wanted to make room for another desk back here.
Oh boy.
Right now in the nerd room, my desk and workspace, as well as my son's desk where he does his homework and, his video editing and stuff, live in the nerd room. And Maria also wanted a desk. She's like, you guys have a workspace. I want a workspace back there. And so, oh boy. Okay. So that means we have to move furniture. And I'm looking around. I'm like, well, if we're going to move this furniture, we have to empty it because all the furniture is all of the cabinetry and shelves and toolboxes and display cases and stuff that go in the nerd room. And I was like, well, that means if I'm going to move it, even if I'm going to move it 6 inches, I have to empty it. And so this was the week. And of course, we chose the first week of school, the most busy time in the world. But I'll tell you, there was something very rewarding or very like, is cathartic the right word of like
Sure.
spending all day getting calls and texts and emails and responses and phone calls and this and this and this, and then just coming home and just doing grunt labor of just like emptying shelves, making piles, throwing stuff away, moving furniture, just no screen at all, just doing this work. It finally happened. Like I went through all the cupboards and cleaned them out. Oh, so here was the thing that happened was we were like, how are we going to make space? Like all of the space is completely full. So one recommendation I do have, which was like really the nerdy part of it, was we went to a place called circlefurniture.com.
Okay.
And Circle Furniture is awesome. It is just a free online, basically interior decorator kit where there's just tons and tons of images of chairs and desks and cabinets and anything you can think of, toilets, doors, windows, everything. And you put in the measurements that they are, and they adjust to the size. So you can put in the size of the room. So basically you measure the room. That's your game room now, right? So I'm sitting in that chair right there.
Wow.
So you measure everything out and then you just grab it. Desk, measure your desk. Okay, my desk is 48 by 36. Pipe it in there and it adjusts to the room. And then you can click and drag everything around. I mean, even like the exercise bike is there.
Yeah.
Looking like an exercise bike and stuff.
Yeah.
So we measured all of the furniture we had and we just started getting creative, clicking and dragging it around the room and trying to fit and trying to fit and trying to fit. And it wouldn't fit. It just wouldn't. So what we figured out was we needed about like 10 inches. Like if we could just get 10 inches, we could fit everything in this room. We have a fridge back here, right? The craft beer fridge is also in the room. And this is a gigantic refrigerator that Maria and I bought when we first moved out into our first condo. I mean, the thing is almost 20 years old and it's huge and it's probably not very energy efficient and all this kind of stuff. And we're like, you know what? If we downsize the fridge and got something smaller and more energy friendly, we could fit it all. So that's where it started. And we went out and we found a smaller fridge and all this kind of stuff. And once that went in, then all the pieces were in place. And it's like, okay, we can put the new fridge in. That means we can move the toolbox. Well, to move the toolbox, we got to take everything out of the toolbox.
Oh gosh, toolboxes are the worst.
But oh my gosh, I'm so glad we did it. We finally did it. And now the toolbox is clean. It's organized. There's space in it. You can find things. We probably threw out 2 garbage bags worth of like old screws and weird furniture pads and like just all this stuff we didn't need. Boom. Okay, we got that moved. Now we can move the display cases. Cool. Take all the miniatures, everything out of the display cases, move them. And it's like, oh, you know what? I'm going to be a little more purposeful about how I arrange stuff this time. So now there's a shelf just for the more sane campaign, which is awesome. So it's got all the more sane characters and dragons. The sheriff's office is in there. There's another one for our other big Rise of Tiamat campaign with Tiamat and my characters and all the robo dragons, like all the stuff we did there. And then just filtering that out so that there's space. So I'm super happy with that. Then it was, okay, now we got to move this shelf and take everything off the shelf with all the sporting goods and picnic stuff and whatever. Like, and so everything got moved and everything got emptied out and reestablished. I could not be happier because I've been talking about this place needing a cleanup for a year now, and we finally did it, and it's good. Feels like a good accomplishment. But yeah, the circle furniture thing, super cool to play around with. You can design your whole house on there and put in all of your stuff and move it around, and even think about like, oh well, I want to get a new couch and it's this size. Put it in there and see, how much space it's going to take up, and can I open the door? Like that's the other cool thing is like with the cabinets, it shows like, oh, this is a thing with a door that opens, so don't put anything in front of it, kind of stuff.
Sure. And then you put in the measurements of your doors too, and your walls and everything,
and the windows and walls and everything, and it just built it out, and then you just click and drag it around. And
wow, that's exciting! That's exciting. I can't wait to see it. For me, the nerdiest thing I did this week, I made some time finally, made myself stop working and play Final Girl. So I got in a couple of games. I'm reminded and reinvigorated why I love this game. I have yet to win one. My Final Girl has not survived yet, and I'm having a blast. And I never would have thought that I would like a game so much that I haven't won. Yeah, I'm trying out a bunch of different strategies and different ways to encounter. I was really close this last game. Really, really, really close. Hans, the bad guy, was down to 1 health and I had like 4 left, and I'd saved a bunch of people. So I had some extra like not powers, but I had some like extra things that I could do because on the little card, if you save people, you get like a little extra bonuses. Was down to the final one, but then just some bad rolls. It's dice rolls, and bad rolls meant, I was in trouble. And I also learned, like, I picked up a bow and you get 3 arrows, and I did 1 per turn when really I probably should have just shot at him all 3 times all at once in 1 turn, and like just different things that I'm trying. But man, I was ready. 1 more blow. I had found another weapon. I found an axe, and I was just waiting for him to come to me, but my rolls were so bad that he got to his dark power card. And when I turned that, it was an automatic 3 strikes at max level and just wiped me out.
Wow.
It was so close.
Remind me, is this one have an app? Is this app driven or is it just card driven? Like
it is all card driven.
Okay.
Now there's someone who has made an app to help track stats, but I don't need that because I went with the all in when they had series 2 come out in Kickstarter, which means it came with 2 neoprene mats that help you track everything. It's really well done. Actually, series 1 and series 2 came with mats. The series 2 mats are improved. So I've been using the series 2 mats even when I'm playing series 1 games because it's all trackable there. So people can play this game they can just buy a feature film and the core box and just play that over and over and over. I've shown you the storage boxes. They come off and they're magnetized, and one side is the board for the game and the other side is the board for the bad guy. And then the core box comes with the Final Girl cards. You don't even need the minis, right? You can use little meeples that come in the core box. They made it so you don't have to have all the fancy things. Because I have all the fancy things, I don't feel like I need that tracking app. But you can't play the game just on the app alone, and you don't need the app to play the game. So 3 days from now, they are going to launch Series 3.
You said there were a couple, you said, they got to have the Scream guy in it. They got to have this. They got to have this. Or you weren't going to do it. What are you doing?
They have 2 of those 3. They did not make a feature film on Ghostface. Okay. However, I did. So some of what I've done, talk about nerdy. Last week, I joined a Final Girl board game group on Facebook. Yeah. I had no idea that the owners of the group were the guys who created
that's the best.
Guys who created the game. Yeah. Because they answer questions right away. So, right. One of the creators said, hey, we're going to give away, a series 3 to someone, answer this question. So I answered the question, and it was like, what's your favorite moment? And I went in and told the story of my favorite moment. But then a little bit later, I went back and I was like, hey, by the way, would we ever see a Ghostface type character? And he wrote back almost right away and said, that's been in our plans. We don't know what we're doing with that yet, but just wait for some announcements. So they're hinting at some big,
it's going to be an unlock on the Kickstarter. Yep.
That's what I'm thinking. So I might wait and see. I might just do it. I mean, the good news is I don't have to do the all in. Series 3 core box might be $100. I remember it was like almost 400 to go all in on series 1 and 2. So if I cut that down because I don't need all the things, I don't know. I'm going to wait and see, but man.
That is a pro tip though. Like when you get into a board game, you kickstart a board game and you go buy a new board game, go on to Facebook or whatever and find that group so you can see others and they're painting their miniatures. They're excited about it. You can see their thing. I think I've told the story about with the TMNT miniature game, the Ninja Turtles miniature game.
Yes.
I was on the Facebook page and it was the same thing. The designer was the guy who, was running that page or created it or whatever. And I was posting pictures of me and Andrew playing and Andrew was like, I don't know, 10. He was still cute.
Right.
And, and the creator's like, oh my God, that's so cool that your son loves the game so much. And he sent him an autographed beta card, like a Michelangelo card that they were using in like the first beta editions of the game.
Oh, wow.
Where the art and everything is all different, but that game in a sleeve with the guy's autograph on it, like replaced it in our game for him to play with. And I was like, that's what a cool thing. Yeah. So that's definitely something to do is join those Facebook groups for the games that you're excited about.
Yeah, and it's definitely helped hearing other people's. That's when I say I've been changing my strategy is because I've been reading how other people are playing the game. So yeah, just it reignited how much I like this game, and now I've got to squeeze in time to finish painting series 2 so I can play those games too. So.
Next episode, we're back to a nerd watching episode where we go through a decade and talk about our favorite TV shows and movies and influential things on that. So it's the aughts. 2000 through 2009, and we're going to show our favorite nerdy television and films that started off the 21st century. I'm excited.
Yeah. We got the 80s in, the 90s in. Now it's time for the aughts.
right? Then we'll do the 10s, and then we'll still kind of be in the middle of the 20s. So maybe we'll go backwards after that.
Ooh.
Go back to the 70s, the 60s, the 50s. Like, that'd be fun. Time will tell. We just got to keep doing seasons of Nerd Best Friends, which leads us into our closing remarks. Remember to subscribe, share, and give us that 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media platforms at Nerd Best Friends, or send a message by writing to podcast@nerdbestfriends.com.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Write to us. Tell us what you think about our books, or tell us what your favorite book is.
Patreon.com/nerdbestfriends. All right, I'm going to go on to this next one is another book series from the 80s. And this is called The Incarnations of Immortality by Pierce Morgan. These books are...
Wait.
I'm sorry, Pierce Anthony.
Pierce Morgan?
No.
I was about to say, he's not that cool.
Nope.
Okay,
I don't know
good.
why.
Woo, all right.
All right, let's try that again.